So let's talk now very quickly about a sample memo for our narcoleptic cab driver problem, but a memo that incorporates our synthesized rule using all three cases. Now this just builds on the sample memo that we had discussed when we were writing our answer using only Cohen versus Petty as our legal authority. But as we know, there are now two other cases, and by synthesizing an overall rule from those three cases, our outcome may be different, and our analysis is definitely going to be different. So I'll just highlight some of the differences. All of the text in black is the stuff that was in our original sample memo when we had written out our answer using only Cohen versus Petty. And the red text is all the new stuff that I've added since reading those two new cases. Now the first thing I'll point out is that in our issue question, I've added the facts that the defendant is a taxi driver and that the plaintiff is a passenger. Now these facts were true before. I mean, he was a cab driver before, but they weren't legally relevant when we were only using Cohen versus Petty as a legal authority. But now, after reading the other two cases, we know that the fact that defendant is a taxi driver is relevant. It matters to our analysis because, well, we know now that whether the defendant is the operator of a public common carrier matters. And likewise, we know that whether the plaintiff was a fare-paying passenger in that common carrier might matter. In the next paragraph, the only thing that I've changed in the rule statement from Cohen versus Petty is to say generally. And that's because we're now aware of the fact that the Cohen versus Petty rule doesn't always apply. There are some exceptions, or at least one exception that we know of, and that's for operators of public common carriers. And we explain this rule a little bit more thoroughly in the next couple of paragraphs. So before we just gave the rule, and we mini-briefed the case. Right? We identified the holding, the relevant facts that led the court to that holding, and the reasoning that the court had, why those specific facts led to the holding. But after reading those other two cases, we know that that rule requires a little more explanation. Now we have to explain that, well, that's just the general rule. It doesn't always apply in all cases. It doesn't apply to common carriers under certain circumstances. And I've given an example here. This example really is just a very mini brief of the G case, where I'm explaining, so that's why in G, when a bus driver suddenly fainted and crashed his bus into a utility pole, the operator of the bus service was still liable, despite the Cohen versus Petty rule. But we're not done yet. Common carrier exception has an exception of its own, and that has to do with whether the defendant, well, the driver of the public common carrier was acting in the usual scope of operation of a public common carrier. So we explain that as well. And again, we give a very mini brief explanation of an example of that. But this example really, it's just a summary of what happened in the Flagg versus Ciccarelli case. And so that's why a person who was riding in a cab but got a free ride from an off-duty driver, well, was just treated as a guest, not entitled to a higher standard of care. So it's probably worth pausing this video and looking over these new paragraphs to make sure that you understand what's being included in here. This is still an extension of the rule. This is the rule that we had in our original memo when we only used Cohen versus Petty. And in synthesizing a new rule, well, it has more nuance to it. It requires more explanation, more moving parts. And so we have to, we have to give a little more explanation here. The next thing I'll point out is that because the new rule has some more moving parts to it, I've added headings. Before, we just had one issue to deal with, whether there was any reasonable reason that the defendant should have anticipated his illness. That was the only issue, and so I didn't need to have a heading for it. But now there are other issues too, other sub-issues. So now I've included this heading to talk about anticipating the illness. The other issues are whether the defendant was the operator of a public common carrier. So I've got a heading for that, and analysis for it. And then a heading for whether the driver of that public common carrier was acting in the usual scope of operation at the time of the accident. Now in both of these are still IRACs, little sub-IRACs, right? So we start with the rule, and we give the arguments for each side, the comparisons. and how the case might be distinguishable. So again, these paragraphs you might want to take a closer look. Pause the video, reread these, and make sure you understand why they say what they say. And finally, I've crossed out the previous conclusion because that conclusion was only based upon Cohen versus Petty. But we have more information now. We now know that the fact that the defendant is a taxi cab driver might actually affect the outcome. So I have a new conclusion. And the conclusion is that, well, even though he couldn't have reasonably anticipated his narcoleptic episode, he's probably still liable. Probably still liable. And that's because of the higher standard of care imposed on common carrier operators.